Blender handles images a little bit differently than you might expect when you first start working with it. And in this video, I want to cover exactly how it's getting these images and how it's saving them. And that way we'll avoid a lot of frustration later on down the road when we start painting our own images and doing all these different things with lots of textures. So here I have the Orbot scene that I also used in the Fundamentals of Materials and Shading course. It was sculpted and created by Kent Trammell. And I have a couple textures here that I want to apply. And we talked about the principled BSDF in that course and how to bring in all of these textures. And here I have just a folder called textures sitting right next to the blend file called orbot.blend. And then I'll just bring in each of these individually. So I'll have the albedo texture, plug that into the base color. And I'll just leave this off to the side of my screen and drag and drop it right in. We have a metallic texture, color into metallic. And like we talked about in the previous course, this needs to be set to non-color data because it doesn't have to do with color reflecting off the surface. And then we also have a roughness texture, also set to non-color. Plug that into the roughness. Then we've got an emission texture. That one is colored. And then also we have a normal map. Okay, that one's already brought in as non-color. Plug that into the normal map node and we're all set. Okay, so here we have all of our textures applied here. So we could go ahead and save our file with Control S, and of course it'll save our material here with all the textures applied. So if we go to close Blender and then open it back up, we should see exactly the same thing. And if we go to File and Revert, which is just another way of saying reloading the file, then nothing's going to change. It'll bring in all of those textures. But what happens if we decide to change something about our file structure? Let's say we move our blend file. Let's say we have our introduction folder here, but let's say we need to rename the textures folder from textures to Orbot textures to be a little bit more specific. And it could be whatever. You might just need to move the folder somewhere else, whatever it happens to be. But let's call this Orbot textures now. And if we go and reload the file here with File and Revert, then we're going to get a lot of problems. We're going to get a bunch of just glowing pink. And it's glowing because we have that plugged into the emission. Otherwise, it's just normal pink. You can see the normal map's broken and everything has gone wrong. Well, the reason for this is that Blender no longer knows where these images are because the images weren't saved into the blend file itself. They were saved as references to where they were on your computer. And we can see this if we go to the node here and hit N on our sidebar. And I'll go down to Properties. And under Source, we can see exactly where it's trying to find it. It's trying to find it under / textures, with the double slashes being the folder where the .blend file is found. It's trying to look in the textures folder, and then it can't find the textures folder, so it can't load the images. And same thing with all of these. So what we need to do in order to actually fix that is to go to File, External Data, because we're working with external files, and then choose Find Missing Files. Then we just need to go to a folder that contains all of the textures, and it could be a subfolder here, so I don't even have to navigate into that. I can just click Find Missing Files, and you can see that it will correct all of those file paths here. Go to Orbot textures instead of just textures, and then as soon as this scene reloads here, then all of our textures are back and we're good to go. And then we can click Control S and save that, and we won't have any problems going forward. But there are a couple different ways of finding files. First of them is relative, which is what we've been talking about so far. It starts at the blend file and then goes from there. But there's another way, which is the absolute path, which starts all the way from your C drive and works from there. So what's the benefit of that? Generally, it's better to keep things as relative, but let's say you have a central textures folder somewhere on your computer and you need to move this to somewhere else. So let's say instead of renaming the Orbot textures, let's just save this and close out. Let's say we move this to our desktop. Okay, and then we did that. Let's click and open it again. Even though the textures are in the exact same space, they're now missing because, of course, according to the blend file, there is no Orbot textures folder right next to it. So in order to fix that, here, what I would do, if we wanted to keep our textures in the same space, I'll move that back and open that up again. Here we have our textures. We could go to File, external data and make all paths absolute. So now instead of being relative to the blend file, it's relative to the C drive. And you can see that here in the path here. It starts at C user and goes all the way through. So it's going to be a really, really long path name. But if I were to save that now, Control S to save, close this out, I can move this file wherever I wanted it to. And as long as the textures are in the same place relative to the C drive, then I can open this up again and everything would still work. Okay, but it's usually best to keep things as relative to the blend file, and that way you can just move them around as a package or move the parent folder around and everything just works. You can also zip it up and send it to other people, and that's really the best way to go. So I'll go ahead and move that back in here. And I'll also show you one other way of saving images, and that's within the blend file itself. So let's set this back to file and set it back to relative. But now let's say you want to actually send this file to somebody else, and you don't really want to zip up an entire folder. You just want to send just the .blend file. Well, what you could do is you could go to File, External Data, and pack all into .blend. And now all of these images are now going to be packed. So as soon as we save our file here, then we're going to get this icon and the path name is grayed out. And that just means that it's packed into the file and we don't have to worry about where it's found on the computer at all because it's in the blend file itself. So now if we were to go ahead and close this out, I made sure to hit Control S and save. Then we're going to get a much larger file size, of course. You can see it's jumped up to 46,000 kilobytes. So it's a bit bigger, not huge, of course, because you don't have a ton of textures, but it's definitely going to be a bit bigger and a bit slower depending on if you have a really, really big scene with lots of textures. But now we could actually go ahead and even delete all of these textures to begin with. So now they don't even exist on our computer at all. But if we double click this, because we packed them into the file, they're still going to work. So this is really, really good for sending your file to other people. You absolutely have to do this basically if you want other people to see your scene and actually understand what's going on, because otherwise the textures are going to appear missing and that's really, really bad. But of course, it's not really that great to work this way. It might seem intuitive that, oh, you just pack everything automatically. And in fact, there is an option for that. With file and external data, you can automatically pack into .blend, and that might work for some situations where you have a bunch of fairly low resolution textures or just not that many textures to work with. But if you have hundreds of textures or a bunch of like 8K textures, then that's going to slow down your file a lot, and you don't want to do that. So if you get a file that's packed, what you could do is go to File, External Data, and then unpack into files. And I usually just use the first one, use files in current directory and create when necessary. And then it's going to then unpack all of these and save them right next to the blend file. And it'll save it as a relative path. So if we were to save this again and close this out, then you'll notice that we have a new folder just called textures right next to the orbot.blend, and it contains all of our textures. And our file size for the blend file has been reduced to about 1700 kilobytes. So a lot smaller and faster to work with. So I hope that explanation makes sense of why missing files sometimes happen and what you can do to prevent that, especially when sending files to other people to see, because they're not going to have access to everything that's on your computer. But the other time that this becomes really important is when we're texture painting. So we're going to do a little bit of that in this course as well. And we can do that in the image editor, and I'll just demonstrate this super quickly because I don't want to get into all of the details here. But if we go to our 3D viewport and split it in the top left, and I'll switch this over to the image editor, and I'll just create a new image here called texture test and click OK. Then we have this blank canvas. We can switch the mode to paint. We can bring up sidebar with N, toolbar with T, and let's just pick a white color, and I'll draw a smiley face right here on the front. Okay, so we drew our smiley face. Let's say we're using this inside of our orb here or whatever. We could just have, I'll shift D, find our texture test. Here we've got our smiley face. Okay, so we can't see it, very well on the orb itself. But we have our texture here that it's doing something. We've made a change to it. And let's say we want to save our file. So we go ahead and hit Control S to save. And then you might think that, oh, we saved, we're good to go. Not remembering that images are separate from the file itself. So if we go to now, just close this out, thankfully we're going to get an error. We used to not get an error, and this was incredibly frustrating, and you could lose just hours and hours of work accidentally, and that was very, very bad. So thankfully, there's this little warning now that says, hey, do you want to save this image before saving or before closing? And you can say, yep, I do want to save it, or you can say don't save. I'll go ahead and cancel that. And now that our day has been saved by that warning, we can go to image. There's a little asterisk here to just kind of remind you that this has changes that have not been saved yet. We can click that and then go to save, and we can save this as our important smiley. Save as image, and there we go. Now if we were to save our file, it's saved that externally. We can go ahead and close that. You can find that in our textures folder, and then when we go ahead and open up our file again, then it'll be right here. But if we were to make a change to this, and for whatever reason we didn't save, and we went to file and revert, or just closed without saving, then all of those changes would be lost. So be very, very careful to always save your images as you're working with them externally outside of Blender, and be sure to pack them into the file when sending them to other people.